So let's ask the audience, get your smartphones out. We want to know from you where you stand on Hélène's idea. Would you trust a large assembly of randomly selected citizens with some amount of legislative power? So do you think that more democracy would actually be a good idea and yield a good outcome? Again, make your selection. Would you trust a large assembly of randomly selected citizens?
Could I ask a question?
Yes. Of course.
I mean, is there no constraint at all on the people who could be up?
Sorry, we're getting your mic.
I mean, do you really see, no, people vote already, but do you really seriously consider completely random?
Yes.
Or do you pre-select the people?
No, no pre-selection.
Okay. Well, then I know what I have to do.
Okay, let's get to the results. It's pretty evenly split, I would say. Let's give them a few more seconds and see what Ernst decides. I don't know whether he will tilt the balance here. Would you trust the large assembly of randomly selected citizens? Very narrow victory for the yes camp, 54%. Hélène, I'll let you respond to that. Why do you think there's so much skepticism here?
Because I asked the more radical question of transferring legislative power, and I think for a lot of people it's too much too soon. If I had asked, would you be okay with a citizens' assembly having a say in the process and being one of the actors that a parliament is listening to, I think I would have probably gotten closer to 80%. But transferring legislative power, I'm asking this question because this is really what I want, actually. I do think that this is something the Greeks did routinely, the ancient Greeks who invented the first prototype of democracy. And I think it's the only thing to me that is consistent with trust in the ordinary citizen.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to understand how that would work. That's a huge, huge undertaking, logistical undertaking. And that group, that would then be randomly selected, because we always talk about biases within one political party. Wouldn't they, after deliberation, also form a bias? Would they be so much better?
Well, I'll tell you that it's already taken place in, not completely institutionalized form, but take the first climate assembly in France that we had in 2019. Macron told them, a random group of 150 French citizens, tell me how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in France by 40% in a way that respects social justice, so I don't have the yellow vest on my back, and I'll put it straight to regulation or a referendum or a parliamentary vote. This was, to my mind, the first time that a French president gave a form of proto-legislative power to citizens. Okay, he backtracked on it afterwards. There were a lot of filters. It didn't really happen that way. But at least the idea was kind of like planted that this could be an option. Look at the Ost-Belgium example. In Ost-Belgium, so in the German-speaking region of Belgium, they've created a permanent citizens' assembly. It's a very small group. To my mind, there's a problem there. It's too small. It's 24 randomly selected citizens, but they're given agenda-setting power, meaning that they get to decide what the parliament should act on or decide. And of course, it's not a complete transfer of power, because at the end, the parliament remains sovereign and doesn't have to implement what's being recommended. But I think it's a first attempt to go there in a sort of pre-legislative position. And where parliaments fail over and over again, for example, on climate issues, for example, if we take them seriously, I know some people will disagree, but or on, for example, in the US, there was this big discussion about should parliamentarians be able to do insider trading, which they do all the time, right? It's totally normalized corruption. We cannot expect legislators to regulate themselves on issues like that. So you could transfer some amount of legislative power on a bunch of issues where it's kind of uncontroversial that even random people would do better than our elected officials, because there's too much of a conflict of interest or too much of a, unofficial corruption by corporations that they cannot act. And a group of randomly selected citizens could. They did it in Ireland as well, on abortion. I could give you many examples at this point.
Mm-hmm. Jason, what's your biggest issue? Where do you see the biggest flaw with that approach?
The funny thing is I would have voted yes on that too, and not just by leaning on the word some. Like they can choose the flag, that's fine. Here's some of the worries I have about this. One is agenda control. Who's going to decide what question they get to ask? How is this question posed to them? A persistent finding in marketing theory and political science is the question we give you, the way we phrase the question changes how you answer it. If there's moderation, who's the moderator? Is this influenced unduly by politics? Is it a question that's overly technical that we can't expect lay people to know the answer to? Will there be other kinds of biases in how people deliberate? Because when I look at the empirical literature on deliberation, it's kind of mixed. Sometimes deliberation seems to work really well. Sometimes you get radical polarization, infighting or avoiding of the hard questions. I don't think we really know now how to make deliberation work on a large scale. And then there's a question, there's an objection that people have, like, as a person who favors experimenting with lotteries as well, that we get as an objection, which is, it's not really democratic. I don't think that's true, you don't either. But they'll say, but the problem is, now you're taking 500 people and you're giving them an incentive to know something, but they're not really speaking for the rest of us because they might be unduly influenced by what others think, or I didn't really get a say. And there might be a question of the perceived legitimacy of that system as well.
Okay, these are all excellent points.
But
I do think that there's more to learn about under what conditions these assemblies perform best. In particular, when they are large, there's a question of their governance. When it's 24 people, they can get to some kind of agreement and set their own agenda, so that takes care of the agenda problem. But the question is, when they're 24, how much is their agenda representative of the preferences of thousands, if not millions of people? So there's a question of how do you scale those things so that you get the representativeness that's given by large numbers, and at the same time, the capacity for self-governance. And so far, I was on the governance committee of a citizens' assembly in France last year on end of life, on assisted dying. Amazing experience. I could spend the whole day talking about it. But the one thing I've learned is that, so basically people like me, experts, were appointed from outside to govern those citizens. And that doesn't, I don't find that totally legitimate. I understand it's a transition phase where we're trying to understand how to indeed equip these assemblies with a form of capacity for self-rule and sovereignty, and so maybe we will eventually fade out people like me and create structures of representation internal to those assemblies, but we're not there yet. So, I mean, again, I'm asking this because it's a long-term project. We need to learn more.
Mm-hmm. There is an example in the U.S. and in a couple of states and a couple of cities across the U.S. where people get to vote how the budget in each city or municipality is actually spent. In some places, they've canceled the whole project because it simply didn't work. And only, I think, a little bit more than 1% of all people in that city actually took part. They weren't interested, or they didn't feel like they had an impact. The city council said, hey, but there's other ways of getting, of having your say. You can run for city council. We don't want a weird shadow government emerging from this. Why do you think it failed?
But perhaps because, I'm not aware of this experiment, because actually if I think of participatory budgeting, which it sounds like is what you're describing, it's been very successful for many decades in Brazil. It's now has a second life in New York, in California,
but even in Brazil,
But in Brazil, it sort of died down, I know. So,
it's in decline, yeah.
Well, I think the problem is that there's not much deliberation built in, as far as I can tell, and there is definitely a problem of incentives once you reach a certain scale where your voice is just like 1 in a million. What difference does it make? And I'm not an advocate of direct democracy all the time. I think this needs to be timed correctly, respect people's times and value it. And we're all busy. We have, families and individual pursuits and jobs. You can't be constantly on your smartphone voting for this or that and getting informed. It's too much. I think even the frequency in Switzerland for four times a year is pretty high. So maybe that's why. Maybe the stakes were not high enough. Maybe people didn't feel it was serious. It was a sort of participation washing. I don't know what happened there, but I do think that for me the key is to think in terms of what kind of democratic representation we want to have, not so much in terms of like, oh, let's vote on everything all the time.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. Jason, let's talk about your idea. To me, it still seems incredibly theoretical. Is there any country in this world which does exactly what you're prescribing?
No, but if you'd like to hire me to help your country do it, you can get my email address at the end of this program.
Who comes close?
No one's really done anything like this. It's an idea, and there is a point. We're philosophers fundamentally, and there is a point in throwing out new ideas and hoping that people will experiment with it. And so if I had to even recommend who should experiment with it, I would say in the United States, New Hampshire, my home state of New Hampshire, because it's relatively non-corrupt. It seems to be pretty cohesive. If I had to pick a country, I might pick Denmark, and so on. But
yeah, I just want to point out, Jason, with all due respect, that philosophers don't have much of a historical memory, but these kind of literacy tests have been prevalent across history, and usually their impact has been really bad. I mean, they've been used to exclude, the usual suspects like blacks, women, and so I think going back to this kind of practice is bad. It's bad news for everyone. I think that's why no country on earth is going to go back to something like that. It's too blatantly gameable by racist, by sexist, by all the bad guys, basically. I don't see that as having a promising future.
Jason, you say Denmark would be a good candidate. What about Switzerland?
Well, you guys are doing a pretty good job with direct democracy, so maybe you don't need to change your course. But let me respond to that point. Sometimes people will say things like, during the Jim Crow era in the United States, they gave people literacy tests, and the result was to exclude black people. But the thing is, they gave them very selectively. If you actually look at the tests, they're extremely hard. The overwhelming majority of people couldn't pass them, and in fact, they didn't. It wasn't that white people passed them and black people didn't. It was that they only gave them to black people. What if they give them to everybody? Well, there's some reason to think that actually Jim Crow would have gone away sooner rather than later, because the kinds of people who could pass these incredibly demanding tests also tended to be anti-Jim Crow, more economically liberal, more open, et cetera, et cetera. But keep in mind, I'm not calling for, in principle, if excluding a certain group of people from voting led to perfect government, in a way I'd be okay with that in principle. In the same way that I'd be in principle if it turned out making you queen of the world led to otherwise perfect results, great, I would be okay with that. In principle, I don't really care what form of government we have, I just want what works, and that's it for me. But that said, what would happen in the United States right now? I'm not talking about a system of excluding people from voting. I'm talking about everyone gets to vote, and then we use how they get to vote to estimate what a fully informed public would have wanted. A demographically identical country, exactly the same in terms of demographics, what they would have voted for if they had had perfect information on this test. And because we collect the demographic information and it's all released to the public, every newspaper has it and so on, we're actually able to check to see if there's any demographic bias. This is the method that political scientists and economists have been using for 30 or 40 years now to actually assess things like, how does the fact that you're rich affect your voting behavior? How does your knowledge affect your voting behavior? How does your gender affect your voting behavior? This is the method that we use. Of course, if implemented in the real world, politicians would corrupt it in various ways. They'd corrupt it more in Rhode Island than they would in New Hampshire. They'd corrupt it more in Poland than they would in Switzerland, right? But the question for me is not, is it perfect, but is it better than what we're currently doing?
Do you agree that it's better than what we currently have, or where do you see the biggest flaws?
Well, the one flaw that I see is that who is going to determine the kind of knowledge and sort of a question that are on that quiz? And my sense is that not only are these quizzes very elitist and geared to journalists and academics, but on top of that, there's zero empirical evidence that it correlates with the capacity for good judgment on political issues. There are too many factors that intervene between your vote for a specific candidate or a specific platform and the policy outcomes later. There's also, to me, there's something about living knowledge. Like, if you ask people, at blank point, certain questions, certain factual questions about the structure of government, who is the vice president, or they might not be able to answer. Does that mean they're not capable of estimating rather correctly whether the economy has harmed them or served them in the last 5 years, And they do that through all kinds of indirect ways that are very hard to measure for political scientists. Like, okay, my uncle lost his job, my cousin committed suicide, there's something about the fabric of social life that you experience from a very peculiar, vantage point that is impossible to measure by the kind of metrics that Jason is interested in.
Jason,
and they're very important.
Sorry, Jason, your rebuttal?
Yeah, I think we do have some evidence that it works in theory, if not in practice, because we haven't practiced it yet, because of things like how political scientists have studied this. So we take things like, say, the Brexit vote. And during the Brexit vote, people were radically misinformed about facts that were pertinent to that decision. How much money is going in and out of the EU to Britain, what percentage of the country is made up of immigrants, how much crime do immigrants commit. You can ask people, the polling firm Ipsos Mori asked a number of people these questions. Everyone got them wrong, but the closer they were to the truth, the more likely to vote in favor of remaining. The farther they get from the truth, the more likely to vote in favor of exiting. Similarly, in the United States, you can use the American National Election Studies and try this method, and you get interesting results. People have a confluence of values in favor of increased trade rather than protectionism, being more diplomatic rather than being more warlike, having kind of more nuanced environmental regulation rather than just being for and against it, et cetera, et cetera. And these also, by the way, happen to correspond with the views that economists tend to have, which is an interesting result, independent corroboration. But the other thing I would do, I'm going to throw Hélène a bone here, actually, and say, who gets to decide what's on the test? I actually would let a Democratic committee that's randomly selected pick that quest.
Yeah, that's surprising.
Right? That's my big proposal. It sounds like a weird thing to say, because didn't I just say that they don't know what the hell they're talking about? Right? This is the interesting thing. If you ask citizens, like I basically throw to citizens of 500 randomly selected ones, we're going to have an enlightened preference voting system. You get to decide what counts as enlightened. You're going to decide what counts as an informed voter. What do you think that is? When you ask voters this right now, they actually give you very reasonable responses. They say things like, you probably should know who your congressperson is, which, by the way, the typical American doesn't know. You probably should know who your senators are, which, by the way, the typical American doesn't know, and the typical British person doesn't. Well, they don't have a Senate, but they don't know they're members of Parliament, typically. You should know things like roughly where the unemployment line is or what's happening with crime. They say that. They might also say things like, you should know the price of a bus ticket or a gallon of milk, or they might throw in anything, right? Interestingly, they come up with smart things about what they should know, and then they don't know those things, which is a little bit like, if you asked me to design a final exam in, let's say, organic chemistry right now, as a former chemistry major, I could probably come up with a really good exam for organic chemistry, but I wouldn't pass that exam anymore because it's just been too long. I've forgotten all of that stuff, right? So I think when you think about this enlightened preference model, we ask the people, what do you think? Randomly selected 500 people, what do you think is an enlightened voter, a person who counts as informed according to you? We use that. We let everybody vote, including your children and your dog. Everyone gets to vote. And then we use that to estimate what an enlightened public would have wanted rather than our actual unenlightened public wants. We are correcting for any demographic bias. Would that be better? Who knows? We'd have to try it, but I think it's worth a shot in New Hampshire, not California.
New Hampshire. Let's talk about a country that is doing a pretty good job, a democracy. This country. Can the Swiss model, and you spoke at length about Switzerland and what it could do, but can the current Swiss model of democracy be implemented in large countries? That question goes out to you. Get out your smartphones and vote. Can the Swiss model of democracy be implemented in large countries? Now, would you think that the audience here is well equipped to answer this question?
I mean,
they're not randomly selected.
No, we have a technocratic expert audience.
Technocratic, okay.
Yeah. But also people with perhaps with a particular bias. The reason I asked this question of you, to be honest, is I wanted to know your point of view, because when I go around the world complaining about the flaws of democracy, people go, yeah, you're right, California is problematic, and like this country's problematic, this country's mucking it up. But Switzerland does so damn well. Can we make it work elsewhere? And one reason I wonder about this is we have to avoid what you might call the United Nations fallacy. What I mean by that is we have a number of countries that are a member of the United Nations. Therefore, they're all countries. Therefore, they're all nations. Therefore, they're all the same. So this set of institutions, if it works here, should work here. This set of rules, if it works here, should work here. And we know with organizational theory in general that that's not true. You could have two companies that have the same bylaws, and one country will do really well, one company will do well and one will do very poorly because of things that are not part of the rules, like corporate culture. I mean, you have a white paper out front that they can read on this, on corporate culture or other factors that influence how well that company performs, how corrupt it is, and so on. So similarly, when we think about why Switzerland is doing well, it's not obvious. It's not obvious. It's not 100% guaranteed. It's an open question. How much of it has to do with the Swiss structure of government, making Switzerland good, or how much has to do with other things make Switzerland work well, which also makes it so your form of government works well here, but it wouldn't work in California, it wouldn't necessarily work in France, it might not work in Poland, right? I don't really know the answer to this question, but rather than having you ask me, I'll ask you.
You'd rather ask them. 60% of the audience says yes, no, 40% you should know. I don't know if you saw this, but Switzerland did have a bit of a counting problem, figuring out who the third biggest party was, but that's been solved, which is good. But still.
Can I react to this? I tend to think that the Swiss model could work elsewhere, not sure exactly everywhere, since indeed, as Jason said, it's hard to disentangle the institutions themselves from the sort of social fabric and preconditions that have been sort of woven together over centuries. So that's difficult. But that said, one thing that I'm convinced of is that you know, when I bring up Switzerland in the US, I always get the same sort of blasé reaction from political scientists. It's an outlier, would never work. It doesn't generalize, it's sui generis, we don't understand it, we never talk about it actually. It's frustrating because I actually think that institutions have a causal impact on the background culture. And so, yes, you need preconditions for Swiss institutions to work, but those preconditions, in a way, were also created over time by these very practices. So, for example, I'm really struck by the fact that at a time when religious wars were destroying Europe, monarchical Europe, you know, Switzerland was happily living with various sects of Christianism, and there was no bloody murder. And in fact, Switzerland was invoked by the anti-federalists during the 18th century. They were like, look, it's a great model, and what did the federalists say? They said exactly what the conservatives said today, like, no, it's too small, it's too poor, it's too different, and it's too homogeneous. And in fact, they lived with multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic sort of groups for very long, and they've learned how to negotiate those differences. And what helped them negotiate those differences? The constant checking and the constant consultation. So I think that trying to implement wholesale the Swiss model at the global level or in the US right now, it might be too brutal, so you might have to introduce it in bits and pieces and think systemically about how to replicate the conditions, for example, decentralization, for example, high education, welfare support and distribution. But I don't see why it's impossible.
Speaking of consultation, let's ask the audience. Questions?
I think most of us agree that strong civil society is a key element for a vital democracy. The problem is that today the agenda setting for the media and the politicians is made mostly by the polls. And the so-called silent majority, which is probably 70–60% of the people, are not heard. So the question is how to mobilize the so-called silent society. I think part of it would be to foster a culture of debate, of foster democratic, how do you call it, competence in young people, more participation in young people so that they understand what means democracy. I think a person like Herta Müller, she knows exactly what means freedom of speech, freedom of selecting your representatives. So strengthening civil society in schools and by other means, I think this is key for resilience of democracy.
I'm worried about that for a few reasons, and I don't want to say what I'm about to say applies to every country. I think it varies from country to country, but I'll use the US as an example. There's this hope that, you know, if only we got more of the moderate middle to have power, if we had more centrism reflecting the view of the average person, that things would be better. And evidence for that might be that in the 1960s perhaps, or 1950s or 1980s even, maybe politics was more centrist and maybe it was better in the US. Maybe that was true of England as well and so on. And it's gotten to be this point of this multipolar system where you have no overlap between members of Congress ideologically, and maybe that reflects the silent majority just keeping quiet at home. I'm actually worried that the silent majority that's moderate just simply doesn't exist. I think instead they're probably highly agnostic. And for proof of that, if you want to read a book about this, read a book called Neither Liberal Nor Conservative by Kinder and Calamo. It came out a few years ago. And they have about 70 years of data, not just their own, but others from the United States. And they say what really ends up happening is most people in the middle, they're ideologically agnostic. They have no real views at all. If you ask them their question on a particular issue, then because people don't like to say, I don't know, they'll give you a response on the moment. You can then ask them that same question a year later, they'll give you a different response. You can ask them why did they change their minds, and they'll very earnestly say, I didn't change my mind, I've always thought this, but it's not true. And this has been going on for years and years and years. I think, so rather than there being a large, moderate middle that's sensible, I think what you have is a different problem. Some people are what I like to call hobbits. They just don't care about politics. They just want to stay home and watch television and go skiing or whatever. They don't care about politics. And then the people who tend to participate heavily in politics and who actually have ideologies tend to be more extreme and tend to be extremely biased and have antipathy and hatred towards members of other group. So it's in the same way that walking around the US, I rarely see a street preacher who thumps a Bible and says, you need to read this is the word of God, but also I got a Quran here, and you should take a look at that too, just to have fuller understanding. Instead, I think politics is the realm of very biased true believers, and the people who stay home just don't have much of an opinion on anything.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is an essentialization of people based on the current sort of hysteria that's going on in the US. I don't think people are like that at all. I think that people change depending on incentives, on contexts. And my sense is that there are silent majorities that are reasonable. We measure them all the time. And in fact, they are not, their expectations and their preferences are not met by this electoral system, which, as I said, tend to answer, only some categories of people, and also to tend to polarize things that need not be polarizing. Take abortion. There's a great contrast between the abortion debate in the US and abortion debates in Europe, for example, in Italy, right? In fact, both countries were moving toward more liberal views. I think most advanced sort of liberal societies were since the 80s. But in the US, the debate got captured by extremists because the Supreme Court sort of legislated in 1974 through Roe v. Wade that, this is the morally correct answer. We're just going to ignore the popular will and just legislate what's right. So then extremists on both sides sort of capture the debate, and it's been a nightmare ever since. In Italy, there was actually a referendum organized on the issue, and it settled the debate forever on the more liberal end of the spectrum. In Ireland, politicians were incapable of getting out of partisan logic for decades. At the end, they got so desperate that they agreed to try a citizens' assembly. The citizens' assembly brought together a random sample of 99, citizens who listened to testimonies, doctors, women, and at the end came up with a middle-of-the-road conclusion that, should be liberalized under conditions. And then that was put to referendum where about the same amount of proportion of people, 66%, so the silent majority, who was never heard before, put out this recommendation and it became law. So I think there are a lot of silent majorities that are not heard right now.
Mm-hmm. A brief response?
I actually have a question for you. With the recent Supreme Court decision in the United States where Roe v. Wade was overturned, not in the sense that abortion is now criminalized or legal, but rather the Supreme Court said, we're not going to decide this ourselves, we're going to put it down to the state legislature.
Actually, do not disagree with that.
Yeah, okay, I just asked the question. I was wondering if you thought that was a good thing because it's making it more democratic.
I think the debate around it was terrible, but the reality of the decision is actually more democratic to my mind.
Okay.
Let's move on. Another audience question here. Well, one that I don't know whether it's serious or not. Why not let ChatGPT rule us? It's trained on general knowledge, so it's democratic. Yes? No? Maybe?
No. No. That's a joke.
Okay. Let me move on. I think that one was maybe in jest. Given the low turnout, because I wanted to pick up on the mobilization point that both of you made before, and the audience question related to that. Given the low turnout in direct democratic initiatives, wouldn't Landemore's model lead to Brennan's model? So you see a convergence between your models because we have a large part of the population that maybe doesn't want to be part of this more direct democracy, and then your models would converge. You see that?
No, I'm not seeing that at all.
Jason?
Yeah, I'm glad someone asked that because I often use that as a response to the Swiss question. All these national referenda, what's the turnout rate? It's usually pretty low, not always. Who turns out? Well, we have data on that. Highly informed people, better than average people on a lot of cognitive and political measures, et cetera. So would it be better if next time you have a referendum, 100% of people turned out? Would you prefer that result? What if you went back and looked at some of the past opinions that people expressed that didn't show up? Would that have been better? It's not obvious. And it's interesting you're asking about convergence, because in theory, it doesn't matter. In theory, a panel of experts and a democracy perform equally well, provided the following is true. They know their limitations, and they know whether to ask an audience. Like, think of like the game shows that work this way. Poll the audience or poll an expert. A perfect democracy would always know when it should ask for expert opinion, and a perfect epistocracy or technocracy or elite-driven thing would always know when it should poll everybody. So the real question is, in the real world, which one of these things is going to go better, given that they're not going to know when to poll? I would note that democracies don't tend to ask for experts very often, but we're a bunch of experts in here, and we're talking about how great democracy is. So maybe that's some evidence we would ask the audience.
Briefly, let's also get to some
so
audience
I thought a lot about this alternative between, okay, can we have a democracy supported by experts or experts consulting experts consulting the people? It's basically Western democracy versus China, because they have a mass line, as they call it, to consult the people all the time, but it's experts at the top. I think the first model is better because experts know a lot about very little, and when they consult, they don't hear, they don't understand. They cannot process the sort of information coming from people they don't share anything with. Democrats know little, it's true, I agree with that, on a lot of things. So look at what's happening with Wikipedia versus expert encyclopedia. Nature showed that the level of accuracy is about the same, but Wikipedia covers way more topics. It's a lot more diverse. It doesn't judge whether it's better to know about Game of Thrones or quantum physics, right? There's no sense of highbrow, lowbrow knowledge, and I think that's better. So that's why I think on net, indeed, they can be the same most of the time, but on crucial things, it's much better to have a democratic system.
Maybe one or two audience questions? Maybe in the back. I'm trying to get audience questions from people who haven't asked questions before, but...
Thank you very much. That's live. So a question directed to both of you. I'd be interested in your viewpoint on that question. And that is, as a Swiss citizen, albeit being a young one, I would say that there's a point to be made that the most highly valued virtue in the Swiss political system or for Swiss citizens is the ability of saying no. So just to say no to whatever the government comes up with, or also other citizens. I mean, just we have to look at the outcomes of the initiatives. I don't remember that many initiatives that were accepted. So I think for us Swiss people, the power to say no to important questions is very important. So my question would be, how would you implement this veto power or this need for being able to say no in your respective ideas? So maybe, Hélène, for you, how can I make sure that my neighbor is not selected in this committee? And Brennan, for you, I mean, I am all for simulating stuff and science, but how are you going to make sure that people are not just going to blindly follow what the nice computer voice tells them? Because I know from experience, if my GPS tells me to turn left, I turn left, even if there's a big stop sign there. So, yeah.
Who wants to go first?
So if your name comes up, you can say no, actually. It's not mandatory. It's actually a limitation of current assemblies that there's an element of self-selection, since people can say no. So it's not as representative as it should be if it was truly mandatory, like citizen jury, maybe. And right now, the take-up rate is at best 12%, so it's not high. It's not enough, for sure. But, it's a work in progress, and I think as people get more incentives, they get paid to be on those, so maybe you're rich enough to be able to turn down that opportunity, but I guarantee you that there are, people unemployed people, single mothers who look at the possibility of joining for several weekends a group of people and learning and making new friendships and being considered while being paid, while having childcare. It's a lot of people who find that attractive, actually. And I wasn't sure whether the question about, the power to say no, absolutely, I think it's completely key. And if you look at a country like Uruguay, for example, it's the only one of Southern America that chose to follow the Swiss model, so fluke. They decided, okay, we're going to import wholesale those citizens' initiatives and direct democracy mechanism. Well, it's the only country that has resisted the imposition by Washington consensus experts of a bunch of neoliberal terrible decisions that have really afflicted other countries like Argentina and Chile. So Uruguay was kind of saved by the power of saying no to these things, to turning over to the market responsibilities for clean waters, things like that. So I think the power to say no is absolutely essential, and that's what I would try to implement in France right now. We don't have it. We don't have the possibility of recalling a bad law or opposing a constitutional amendment. We just don't have it, so that's something that's very important.
Jason?
I mean, I love the idea of saying no, and one way to say no is to limit the scope of government. We don't have governments decide what your religion is going to be, right? We don't have it decide, perhaps, maybe we don't want a democratic assembly or deciding what the interest rate will be in the central bank. That's a way of saying no to politics. But actually, I like this as an independent proposal. So imagine like the following, like in the United States, we vote on our chief executive in this really roundabout, indirect way. What if you had the option to say none of the above? And if a large percentage of people say none of the above, and the rule has to be someone has to win the majority. You have to get 50% plus one, and if the none of the aboves vote at a high level and you don't get a majority vote, then you don't have a new president. You have to pick somebody else. You have to do another kind of process. I often think that that would be an improvement over current electoral systems. I mean, you want to replace elections. I often want to replace elections too. But I think we should build the right to say no into elections by saying none of these candidates are good enough. This question isn't good enough in a referendum. What if we had that? I think that would lead to better results for the kinds of reasons that are motivating you to ask that question in the first place.
Do you think if the Brits went back to the polls and decided on that question again, what would they say?
I mean, people have been polling them about this every month for the past few years, and it was kind of like, at first a lot of them would go back, and now that it's kind of working okay, many of them wouldn't. And then summer happens and they find out how hard it is to go to Portugal now, and they start being in favor of being part of the European Union again. So I don't know off the top of my head what the current polling data says about England. I do think that it was very narrow, and I suspect there's a lot of regret, but then going back also is a strange thing to people. So.
I see that there are many more questions in the audience, also questions that were sent electronically. Thank you so much for that. Keep that discussion going outside. We will be serving drinks now to keep that discussion flowing nicely. And we'll see you back here in half an hour for the Zurich lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.